welcome everyone to a conversation that is very timely about issues that are of great concern to all of us, but in particular to communities of color. And I want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Rocio Chang, who will introduce our primary conversationalist. Dr. Chang.
Thank you, Dr. Ford. It is with great pleasure and gratitude that I am welcoming Dr. Wizdom Powell to our conversation. Dr. Powell is the director of the University of Connecticut Health Disparities Institute, an associate professor of psychiatry at UConn Health. She serves as the president of the American Psychological Association Division 51, Men and Masculinities, and is an honorary professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa. Her local, national, and international health research investigates the interplay between stress, social constructions of masculinity, and Black male health disparities. In 2011-2012, she was appointed by President Obama to serve as a White House Fellow to Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. This has been a dream coming true, Wizdom, to have you here with us and to learn from you and all the amazing experiences that delightfully so I have been able to witness a bit, and still I am very amazed from your hard work and for all the wonderful connections that you're making in many communities of color. So my first question, Wizdom, is what drove you to focus on boys and men of color? I see that most of your career, if not your entire career, has been devoted to this particular population.
I really appreciate the question, Dr. Chang, and I think I'll start by reminding folks that one of the things I think is centrally important when you're involved in this kind of work is to have some personal skin in the game. You know, I've always felt that the best research is me-search. And in similar ways, I've drawn tremendous insights from my personal and lived experience. I think the most profound push towards this work has come auspiciously, actually, from my grandfather. And I like to tell the story of my maternal grandfather because his legacy has loomed large over my family for generations. My grandfather was a single father at a time when Black fathers were not esteemed and certainly not publicly described as pillars of their households. But he was a single father of 9 children who actually served his country in the Korean War, and actually in between trips across the waters as a merchant marine, he actually cared for his children entirely. And my grandfather also had the unfortunate sort of circumstance of having to flee Alabama in the middle of the night to escape a potential lynching. And as a consequence of that fleeing, that absconsion in the middle of the night, my grandfather never returned to Alabama. Although he missed his mother terribly, he missed his family and the connections he'd made there, he didn't feel safe to return. And if you fast forward, my grandfather actually ended up passing away prematurely from a preventable cancer that was really brought on by alcoholism. And I can't help but wonder if the racial trauma that he experienced didn't actually set in motion a constellation of impacts on his body, mind, and spirit that led to the cancer diagnosis, right? I mean, there are reasons I believe my grandfather didn't transact or interact with systems. I think he was highly mistrustful, and it was rooted in a rational lived experience. And for those reasons, I knew that if nothing more, I wanted to prevent families of color from losing the men that they loved too soon. And it led me to start, this pathway towards a career where I would be advancing health equity for boys and men of color, but also for the women and children that are connected to them and love them.
Wonderful. And we have witnessed you doing that beautifully, we have to say. And one of the things that we really appreciate is your the inspiration that you truly share with all of us when you mix the arts and creativity with the work that you do. Can you tell us a bit why this is so important to use the arts?
So I love this question, Dr. Chang, principally because most people don't know that I am an artivist, right? That I actually started out my early life being deeply engaged in the arts. And I tell people without hesitation that the arts truly saved my life. The neighborhood that I grew up in, Dr. Chang, was like the neighborhoods you read about. Where there was a lot of love and a lot of traditions of mutual aid and support, but there was also extreme poverty. And I was living in a community during a time at the height of the crack epidemic, which was ravaging our communities and taking out people, mothers and fathers, in ways that has still, exerted an influence over those communities. And so growing up in that community, to have the arts as an escape, as a way to communicate, to connect with others, it meant that I could open myself up to a world that wasn't really readily accessible to me. Through the arts, I came to know opera, and I traveled with the Virginia Opera Company for several years as a part of the child's chorus. I directed plays and acted on stages, and I launched the first open mic night in Chapel Hill when I moved there. And so for me, the arts have always been a medium of expression that I think helps people tap into the deepest reservoirs of their pain and also shared aspects of humanity. I've always felt like art, lowers those communicative walls and encourages authentic dialogue in ways that data and science can't. You put a picture on a wall and you will be surprised at what kinds of conversations erupt. But if you invite a community or an individual to a room and said, we're going to spend the afternoon talking about racial trauma, guess how many people will show up? I mean, it's very unlikely that folks will feel compelled, but the arts have this way of meeting people in their heart space, which I think is critically important as we think about how do we promote healing-centered action in communities and for individuals, and especially in the aftermath of events like what we're talking about today.
I wonder if I could ask to follow on that, Dr. Powell, what conversation do you think we need to have about racial trauma?
Well, I think, Dr. Ford, we have to first start by naming and claiming what is happening. I think part of, the challenge with addressing racial trauma is that we have been afraid to have the bold and courageous conversations necessary to ignite a true policy and practice and systems level response. As my mother would always say, you can't fight an invisible war, right? I mean, if you don't name and claim and legitimize the wounds that people are experiencing, then you're not going to be able to mount, the kinds of interventions that will have sustained and sustainable impacts, positive impacts. And so I really feel like it's important for us to be able to push people towards those conversations and to nudge them to learn more, to educate themselves about some of the issues that are happening that are facing communities of color, but also to to deepen our empathy for those communities, right? Because empathy gaps, I think, are at the root of our inaction, right? If you don't fully see a community as human, as fully human, as worthy, as valuable, then you're not going to be able to mount the kinds of strategies and interventions that will actually minimize the impacts and the hits that they've taken. So I think it's really important that we start to have those conversations, and then we start to talk about how do we then not only subject systems to a forensic examination, right, if you will, to uncover all the insidious ways that racism lives there, But if we don't have the conversations about those issues and systems change possibilities, then we're going to end up at the same river twice, right? And we've had opportunities in the past to have these conversations, and we've squandered them. And so my push and nudge now is to say, we all know that this is real, that it exists, that it's impacting all of us, not just brown and black communities, but as a human race and as a nation. We are all being oppressed by racism, by structural racism. And so having the conversation about that in a real way that removes the typical guilt or shame response, and replaces that with a "I'm standing with you" response would go miles. Would push us miles ahead towards a pathway of healing and liberation, which is so needed at this moment and at this time.
I was wondering, Dr. Chang, this is not just about African American Black communities. It's also about Latinx and other
Absolutely.
communities who've been
Right.
groups who've been marginalized. From your perspective, Dr. Chang, what's the conversation that we need to have about race and trauma and racial trauma?
Thank you, Dr. Ford, for the opportunity to talk about the Latinx community. It's so interesting that, as a result of what's happening now, I think that the Latinx community is responding very supportive to other marginalized communities, and especially the African American community, because it truly resonates with a lot of some common experiences. At the same time, I think that when if I use an analogy, I think that when we grieve, we need to honor the grieving of the families who are mostly the close families of the lost, right? And I think that as a Latinx community, I hope that we are also providing that space for the African American community to grieve, and for us to support the grieving and not making it ours, but also be there in solidarity. I think that that's actually very important. We have many things that we have in common, but we have a lot of things that are very different too. And I think that it's our responsibility to continue growing. First, challenge ourselves, because as an individual, as a member of a family, as also as a member of a community, we all have a lot of strengths, and we also have things that we are not proud of, and things that might sort of have contributed to many of the racial tensions, the ethnic tensions that, many different nations and cultures hold on to. And I see that now there is an opportunity for all of us to open up to those tensions, to hold on to it and not to escape from it, but to grow from the experience. And I really like opportunities, and there are spaces now that are being created where we can all talk together and we can all learn from one another, honoring each other. So that's what I'm seeing, and that's what's making me more hopeful that this time people are more serious to the change that needs to happen.
And I wonder, with that awakening, which, as Dr. Powell, as you said, we've had this before. We had this in the civil rights movement 60, 70 years ago, and some incredible leadership then, and efforts that were incredibly strong, and yet systemic racism persisted. I just wondered, Dr. Powell, from your perspective, and maybe as a white guy, I'm just not getting this, but I'm wondering how much of this is really the legacy of slavery and 1619? Is that overstated, or is that really a fundamental issue still 400 years later?
It is, and it will continue to be, Dr. Ford, until we have had a reckoning with that past, a true reckoning with that past. And so let me sort of explain to some of the listeners about some of the connections between enslavement experiences and mental and physical well-being of African Americans and Black descendant people. What I know is that for sure we have experienced in this country, as a consequence of enslavement, intergenerational trauma. And we now know that trauma lives in the body, in the genes, and in many ways can be transferred from generation to generation. There's an old adage that says if you don't deal with the trauma that you've experienced, the next generation behind you will have to do the healing work for you. And so what we have to understand is that the process of enslavement, not just the actual voyage over the transatlantic sea, like that in of itself, if you imagine being bound together, body to body by chains with very little space to move, breathe, to relieve yourself, but to have to be in those physical conditions, that alone would be traumatizing enough. But if you add that to that, the separation from land, custom, language, and gods, that also could produce long-standing mental health issues and challenges. But also, if you think about slavery and the enslavement period and what was required for property owners to keep their chattel, so-called chattel, in check. So there are many volumes of slave testimonies, which I encourage folks to read, because I think when you hear it from the mouths of people who've experienced it, if you're not moved by that, then you're not alive, right? So listening to those stories, you learn a lot about not just the trauma and the impacts, but all of the healing efforts that were made on the part of enslaved people. I tell folks every day that, that there is something deep in the reservoir of Black and brown folk when you see the same descendants of slaves who are voting, who are raising their families, who are civically engaged in other ways, who pay their taxes, who greet people with joy every day. I mean, imagine what kind of fortitude, resilience, and psychological adaptation it takes intergenerationally to accomplish that. So yes, I think that we have to continue to talk about the residue of slavery because of its intergenerational impact on the bodies, minds, and spirits of African descendants of slaves. That has to be discussed, honored, and not thought of as something we should move through and get over. I'm struck, Dr. Ford and Dr. Chang, by the work that I do alongside leaders in Kigali, Rwanda. And I use the Rwanda as an analogy or a point of reference for the U.S. about how healing work should and can be done effectively. Now, as many of us know, in the 1990s, the country of Rwanda had one of the most egregious genocides, the genocide against the Tutsi. And as a consequence, many thousands of people died. It was a horrific event for the country. But what they did in the aftermath stands up to me as an example of what true healing, justice, and reconciliation work looks like. To this day, every year in the month of April, during the commemoration of the genocide, the entire country pauses to reflect, to remember, and more importantly, to remind themselves that they are one Rwanda, right? The idea that they would separate themselves along these arbitrary physiologic lines made no sense to them, and they took control of that narrative, and they instituted a practice that would require every person to not forget, as we've been told in this country, get over it, move on, but to remember so we don't make the same mistakes twice. And to me, that is what it will take to reckon with enslavement, and also to make sure that not only we grow from it and learn, but that we don't repeat the same mistakes. I think that's why we're still here, in fact. I think that's why we're still in 2020 And we've just had the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor. This shouldn't be happening in 2020.
And as you said, that we look across the ocean to Africa and we see, oh, we are so much more advanced, but we completely missed that in South Africa, truth and reconciliation was taking place decades ago after dozens, if not hundreds of years of enslavement and violence, and then to have that again happen in Rwanda, you're right. It does seem as though we need to wake up. And when you spoke of the resilience, I thought of the words of a very great woman who said, "I know why the caged bird sings," Toni Morrison. And that's such a profound statement.
And actually, that was Maya Angelou. But
you're right. Of course.
But they're connected.
What am I saying?
But
Yes.
they're connected. They're both literary giants of African American literature, of all literature, in fact. But I can see why you would connect the dots, because both of them have spoken really eloquently through prose and fiction about the residuals of enslavement. And in Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, she introduces, Setha, this character in the book who actually, rather than have her child, be born and live into slavery, decided that she would take the child's life. And of course, that's based on a true story, in fact, and a true trial that actually took place during that time. But it makes you realize that fiction, again, getting back to Dr. Chang's earlier point, that our literary heroes and giants, sheroes, actually have this capacity to tell stories, to change the narrative, to paint a picture of enslavement that allows people to understand the potential maddening consequences of being in bondage, sold, raped, and then asked to, bow and kneel to a flag and to a national anthem. I mean, you can understand why some of those feelings would be conflicting for a lot of Black Americans, and why there's still a push for us to have people mark in their memories, in their spirits and hearts, that a wound has happened here. And that's actually what it takes to heal racial trauma. We have to mark the place where the wound has taken place. Trauma reminds you, it's reminding your body, the symptomatology, the hypervigilance, the numbing, the repeated, sort of replaying of images is the body's way of telling you that there's an injury that's happened here. And will you honor it, by paying attention and holding space for that grief, loss, and disappointment?
And perhaps that's why, in some respects, why Brian Stevenson has created that remarkable memorial in Alabama, which really honors those who have stood and those who have paid the ultimate price, but who live on.
Yeah. And it reminds me, too, I was really struck by Brian Stevenson's effort there. I mean, first of all, it's just such a moving tribute to our ancestors, but it also, it's sad because you remember, that not every name is there even. I mean, I think about that a lot, the millions of Black bodies that lie beneath our oceans, whose names we'll never know and whose names will never be spoken, who will not have a monument with a plaque, to mark that they had actually been here in the world. And that should upset anyone, just as it upset us, when our Jewish brothers and sisters went through the tremendous turmoil presented by the Holocaust. We say then, never forget. And we should be saying the same things to Black and brown communities, to indigenous people who have had their land stolen and their language and customs appropriated. Like, we should atone. That's a simple thing. We learned that in elementary school. Say you're sorry. It's a really basic thing, but it goes a long way, and I think could open the way for healing for us, like we probably never have experienced. And I'm excited about this moment because I think that there's so much possibility for that to happen.
And I wonder, Dr. Chang, do you think, is this something that the Latinx community, where to this day, there are still families who are being pulled apart at our borders and in our country, and there are still families who will never see each other again, family members. I just wonder how much, it's not the same as slavery, but there are some of the same kinds of captivity and just treating people as if they are property and not human beings.
So we, one of the things for Latinx that we can identify is the way that we were colonized and how devastated it was for, generations ago to go to this terrible colonization experience that lasted for centuries, right? So, and it truly did a lot of damage, and we continue have experience that also intergenerational and historical trauma as a result of it. That has lasted to many times sort of leave us with this sort of an inferiority complex where, you have been almost brainwashed to believe that being of a light skin is much better than looking, having an indigenous sort of look or profile, right? So within in our own cultures, that's something that we still have to continue grow from the experience. And I think that now there is more appreciation for the native part of, where our origins. But it takes time, and it actually and it's a process. And I think that it needs to be ongoing, and you need to hold people accountable for change to keep on happening. So unfortunately, in Latin America, we still have this way of oppressing the oppressed, and sometimes the oppressed keep oppressing the oppressed, right? And we see it also even here, and there is a lot of things that need to continue improved, but I think that now there is something up in the air that is sort of challenging all these beliefs, all these distorted beliefs that we have held on to for so long, and it's time to get rid of them. Yeah.
I mean, the healing work really is collective village work, right? I like to say that because when you move to more of a healing-centered philosophy versus one that's purely just trauma-informed, then you really are thinking about the collective, and you're thinking about ways to strategize, align those strategies with other groups who have experienced similar forms of oppression. So what we're talking about now, and that we need to name in this moment, of course, is anti-Black racism, right? We have to name that, but we recognize that at the root of that, of anti-Black racism, is a broader set of ideologies that try to separate people based on fictive, physiological characteristics. I mean, my skin is the color it is because of the proximity of my folks had to the equator. I mean, it's just really, it's absurd, right? Race is a sociological invention, but the real aspects of racialized lived experiences are not fictive. Actually, race has a stronghold over how people move through life. There are opportunities for upward social mobility. There are chances, right, to live in this country without being accosted by ICE and other folk. I mean, all of that has to do with physiologic characteristics, language differences that, all resulted because of geography, right? So I think that the moment now has come for folks, one, to name and own the fact that, most Hispanic and Latinx and other communities of color are judged harshly because of their proximity to Blackness. I mean, that's really why. It's like, how far removed are you from Blackness? And that determines what the degree of oppression is going to be for you. So people come to this country and with a lot of hope in their hearts and a genuine openness about connecting to people from other racial groups, and we ruin them. They come here and we teach people to actually hate one another based on these characteristics. Folks who weren't even thinking about racial or ethnic differences in the same way. I mean, you hear this from our counterparts who live in Europe who are like, what's this thing that's dividing the U.S. And it's not as if racism doesn't exist there. It's just that we have learned this really peculiar, unique, and virulent way of treating people differently on the basis of race and ethnicity and language that it can't be duplicated in other places. I mean, we have really honed that craft, sadly, quite well. So the moment now, I think, around healing from racial trauma presents an opportunity for Black and Brown alliances to be refortified, right? I mean, the one thing we know is that racial justice is not a zero-sum game. And in fact, when we create a more racially just society, community, practice space, therapeutic room, that we actually are creating a better, a more equitable and healthy world for everyone. Like it just, you saw for the most difficult and most egregious forms of injustice, and then you see broader justice being applied. It doesn't work the other way around. If you solve for the 1%, it doesn't create a more equitable world for other people. So I think that we have an opportunity to join with Hispanic and Latinx and indigenous communities and Asian American communities who are also being targeted in this moment because of their ethnicity. And so there's a moment, an opportunity for us not to compare wounds and say, hey, I'm hurting more than you, but really to say we are all under the foot of racism, of structural racism. And if we join together in this moment, and this includes white allies, if we own this moment as an opportunity to create unity and strategy alignment, we would be unstoppable. And systems would have to rise up to meet us at that high intention, right? They would have to.
And Dr. Powell, I think when you speak of the collective healing that's necessary, that is so powerful, especially given the way in which the violence that has been done in the name of racial superiority, that myth and complete lie, has so often been done to take people away from their own land. Mm-hmm. Whether they're taken from the land where they lived and mm-hmm. transported to a whole other country, whether they're taken off their land as Native Americans were, and indigenous people have been all over the world, and put into reservations where they're literally ghettoized. And I'm just wondering how much this pandemic that we are now experiencing is perhaps, it's a terrible thing in so many ways, and yet it's opening our eyes to the fact that the people who are most affected are Black Americans and Native Americans. They are, and people who are pressed into ghetto-like conditions, the meat-packing plants and other places where they're the hot zone. I wonder how much this is finally showing us that we can't hide behind the idea that we're safe and invulnerable if we happen to be white and privileged.
Right. I mean, this is a really powerful and important question because it lifts up for the listeners and viewers the fact that, COVID-19 has really just laid bare, as we've been describing, persistent disparities that are not embedded in people's biology. So let's be clear. The fact that we see higher rates of COVID-19 emerging in Brown and Black communities isn't because those bodies are diseased, right? It's because the conditions in which Black and Brown people find themselves often are riddled with unjust distribution of resources, right? So people live in crowded houses, in densely populated neighborhoods where there's more air pollution and air pollution exposure, which increases susceptibility to COVID-19. It's because many Brown and Black people don't have the privilege that either one of us have on this video episode. We can work from home. Right? We're not a part of the labor force that has to go to work or risk not being able to feed your family. I mean, the choices we have, because we have some level of privilege, socioeconomic privilege even, prevents us from being sort of in the group of folks who might be more exposed. But also we have to remember that economic conditions are at the root of health disparities. We know that if you don't read on grade level by grade 4, that the likelihood that you'll end up in a prison population is quite high, which I find remarkably upsetting, right? that if we miss the opportunity early in the life course for folks to get on track educationally, then their health is going to be significantly compromised over their life course. So again, what you're talking about, Dr. Ford, are conditions, social determinants, or drivers of well-being that are rooted in places where people live, work, play, pray, get educated, and get health care. And if we don't exercise out of those structures, the racism that lives in the wires, the flooring, the you know, all of the foundations of our nation, then we're not going to see a tremendous advance with respect to reducing health disparities. It's very important for folks to recognize that the goal also isn't just to reduce those disparities, but it's to advance health equity, which means giving every living human being in our country the fairest opportunity to live their healthiest possible life.
And I guess to do that, we have to get past the myth of color blindness, that
Right.
the color makes no difference. As you're saying, color makes all the difference, but it is not destiny.
Exactly.
It is an artifact. It is part of who we are as human beings. And to use that as a basis for systematic discrimination and racial injustice, that's what's completely unacceptable.
It is, and you know, I'm glad that you raised the notion of color blindness, because I'm sure most of us are hearing this term or this turn of phrase that silence is violence, right? So being silent about the issue is actually tantamount to like structural violence against folks who are being swept up in this most recent wave of racial violence. But it also should signal to us that even saying or trying to appear colorblind is also violent, right? Because what you're saying is that I can only love you and accept you if I can reimagine you in my white skin. Because it's saying I don't see your color, I just see you. So how do you welcome parts of me in the room and ask me to leave those parts of myself outside? So actually, I take quite a bit of offense when people say, I just forget you're black. No, don't ever do that. Mm-hmm. Don't ever do that. That's actually critically important to my identity. And what I want is for you to honor that part of myself and not ask me to shapeshift, change my hair. You know, we just had to pass the Crown Act, right? To ensure that people were able to wear their natural hair to work. I mean, imagine. So all of those, that's why color blindness, you know, as a principle can be structurally violent.
Mm. Well, I wonder if we've had, this has been such a wonderful conversation, and it's so illuminating for me, and I think for people who need to hear and not do so much speaking. So let me stop speaking and ask each of you, Dr. Powell and Dr. Chang, what is it that you would like our viewers to take home from this wonderful conversation?
So I'm going to yield the floor to my colleague, Dr. Chang, first, since I just spoke, okay. and then I'll go after you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Powell. You know, first of all, it has been a great honor to be part of this conversation. Dr. Powell, I admire you tons. And, you know, since you have been at UConn Health Disparities Institute, I have the privilege to work a little bit on your side, and I have learned so much. So thank you. Thank you for all the commitment to boys and men of color and to all the marginalized communities. It means a lot. I think that one of the pieces that, you know, one of the many things that I have learned that you do beautifully is how you bring the voices of marginalized communities into the center of our conversations. And if I could just leave the audience with the curiosity to learn more about your work with the fishbowl activities and the art and all the creative ways that you bring communities together. I think that would be in itself a doctoral degree sort of a project for people to start engaging in. So and you do it artfully. So thank you for that, and I hope that our audience will follow you and will continue learning from you.
Well, I mean, after all those affirmations, I'm a little speechless, but I appreciate it, and I appreciate it because I'm here because my grandfather dared to be here, you know. And I tell folks, I said this in another conversation with folks, were like, well, you know, are you tired? You know, given everything that's happened in these last several weeks, and just the sheer weight of everything on the backs of Black and brown communities, and I said, you know, I could be tired, but I can't stop because my grandfather ran on, you know? He had the courage to do what was probably the most scariest thing an individual could do, to leave his home in the middle of the night as a young person without any ties anywhere else and be sent off into the abyss without those connections. And so his courage and his strength at a time when he had so little, and I feel like I have so much, reminds me that I can't get tired. And so what I would say to folks, and it doesn't mean that I don't rest, because that's a difference. Self-care is critical for all healers. So I think the first lesson I would give to folks is to breathe. And I love Edwidge Danticott's breath, eyes, memory. And I know, Dr. Chang, you know, I use this as a frame a lot, because what is required for trauma to be healed is for breath, eyes, and memory to become one, right? We have to breathe, right? And metaphorically, spiritually, and otherwise, and practically. But we also have to use our eyes to actually think, to look forward into the future about what is possible on the other side of the trauma, so that we encourage people to remember that they are more than the sum totals of their traumas, right? And then we have to remember, like literally remember, put back together that which the past has severed. Otherwise, again, we end up missing opportunities to do better this time than we did before. And so I would say that what we need in this moment more than anything is something very simple my mother always told me about, and that's agape love. We need radical hope, radical healing, and radical love, which means accepting people for who they are, truly, inviting them into a space, a brave space, giving them an opportunity to talk about the pain that is pressing upon them, and not judging them for it, right? Listening with the third ear that we've all been trained to do in this, you know, profession, and really honoring that they have come forward to encounter probably the most difficult level of healing work we could imagine.
Well, thank you so much for your courage and your strength, Dr. Powell, and your perseverance and your deep appreciation, Dr. Chang. As a listener, as someone who has much to learn, I can't begin to thank you enough, and I'm sure all of our audience feels the same.
And we thank you, Julian. We
Yes.
thank you, Dr. Ford, for this opportunity too.
Absolutely. Thank you
Good
so
to be
much.
a listener to great wisdom.